how to move this.
It's the collars.
Oh, here you go.
Hey, Amber. Can you close the blinds behind me? It's up. Yeah, back there. Thanks.
I'm a writer, so I have to read. I'm sorry I can't speak contemporaneously. When Brian was in high school in San Jose, California, he got a job as a dishwasher at a restaurant that was a coffee shop, Coco's, on one side, and Reuben's, a dinner house, on the other. I'd worked there, my sister Bernie had worked there, and so had brothers Kevin and Michael, making the restaurant a McCarry Employment Center for a stretch of 6 or 7 years. Brian earned about $3 an hour. He scrimped and saved his money until he had enough to buy the car of his dreams, a Toyota Celica. It was used, of course, and he'd waited patiently for just the right car at just the right price. Then he babied that car and drove it for the next decade. The savings, the waiting for the just the right price, the careful car maintenance, the driving the car forever were to all become lifelong habits. But he did have one indulgence with the Celica. He bought a vanity plate and it read, "I am last." Because he was. Brian was the youngest of 9 siblings, one of 6 brothers and 3 sisters, or Smothers, as he called us during his 3-year battle against cancer. Smother number 1, my sister Liz, is the oldest of the family, followed by Pat, then Greg, then Bernie, me, number 6, Kevin is number 7, over there, Michael, and then came Brian. On behalf of Brian and our siblings, I'd like to thank you all for being here. It means a lot to the family to see that Brian was treasured outside the family, as he certainly was within. On behalf of myself and my siblings, I'd also like to extend a few additional thank yous, especially to our hostess, my sister-in-law, Vicki. Oh, there's Vicki. For this part. She's my husband's sister, yet for decades she and her husband Craig and their 3 sons, Scott, Brett, and Ben, and now their spouses and kids, have made Brian a part of the extended family. I can hardly think of one holiday, birthday, or family occasion where, if Rick and I were invited, Brian wasn't invited too. Proving that lightning can strike twice, we lost Vicky's husband Craig to a brain tumor last November. Craig was diagnosed just 4 months after Brian, and the 2 of them would sometimes sit together right here in this room and talk about their cancers in a way that they could share only with each other. Brian lived only a mile from here, and after Craig died, Vicki invited Brian over once a week to watch Game of Thrones. And the 2 of them had a grand time trying to follow the cast of characters and squirm their way through the many heated scenes. So thank you, Vicki, for opening your home for this event and for opening your heart to me, little brother. My siblings and I would like to thank Brian's Kendo community, and there are quite a few of you here. Back in, it has been confirmed, 1986. Brian drove our nephew Steve to Highline Community Center in South Seattle, and there they happened upon a Kendo practice. Brian didn't even know it was called Kendo at the time, but that happenstance was the start of 30 years of practice, tournaments, judging, traveling, and friendship. He went all over Washington State, down to Oregon, up to Canada, and even took 7 trips to Japan with Kendo. Through Brian's illness, the Kendo community supported him and never forgot him. I remember one particularly difficult day for Brian in his final weeks. Bernie, my niece Carrie, and I fretted over a planned visit by 4 Kendo friends that evening. We worried whether he was strong enough for socializing, but Brian wanted to go forward. The visit had gone on for a while in the living room when his 3 caretakers commiserated in the kitchen Is Brian okay? Should we intervene for him? Bernie stuck her head in the room and caught Brian's eye. She motioned, okay. And Brian motioned back, more coffee. Kendo was a big part of Brian's life. He loved practicing the art. He loved the friends he practiced with too. Thank you so much. Lastly, my siblings and I would like to thank Brian's employer, Skanska. I can tell you with certainty that Brian loved being a carpenter. In our conversations before his death, I asked him about one of his most memorable days, and he chose a day at work. He described a warm and sunny day in Snoqualmie erecting trusses. He was high up in the air, surrounded by the Cascades. He thought to himself, look at what I'm doing, solving this big puzzle. Look at where I am in this beauty, and I'm being paid for this. I then asked Brian whether he regretted not finishing college, because he was so intelligent. And he said not at all, that he couldn't imagine a career he would have enjoyed more. He loved carpentry for its independence and problem solving, and like with Kendo, he found great friends while doing it. Back when Brian was first diagnosed, he was forced to abruptly stop work. When he was ready to come back, Skanska found work for him. That pattern repeated itself several times as Skanska held the door wide open for Brian. Come back when you can, they'd say, or leave when you have to. And keep your cell phone and iPad just in case. When Brian was working, they accommodated his chemotherapy and doctor appointment schedule. They did everything they could to help him work as much as he felt possible. So Skanska, thank you so much. Days before Brian died, he looked me in the face and said, no eulogies. He said that no one could sum up a person's life. As a ghostwriter for self-published memoirs, I begged to differ. What is a memoir but a summation of a person's life? But given the circumstances, I let it slide. The point being, what I'm about to say is not a eulogy, but instead a very small slice of my experience of Brian, which will prove to be a fierce and independent portrait of a man. In June of 2013, Brian called and told me that he'd been to a doctor for persistent pain in his right side, and he needed a ride for a colonoscopy. The colonoscopy showed nothing. 4 days later, the pain was so intense, he went to the ER and was admitted into Good Samaritan Hospital. He left 3 weeks later with a non-functioning digestive tract and a diagnosis of 5 to 6 months to live. A month later, he contracted a blood infection so severe, the epidemiologist feared it might attack his heart. She warned us that he might not survive. Just months later, Brian had moved from my house back home and was eating again. In January of 2014, Brian had a debulking surgery at the University of Washington where they took out everything that wasn't essential to life, like the spleen, the appendix, and the gallbladder. Immediately following the surgery, Dr. Mann told me and Liz that he'd be surprised if Brian lived another 6 months. 3 months later, Brian was eating and he was back to work. In May of 2015, Brian had a severe intestinal blockage. 2 surgeons deemed it inoperable, but the UW surgeon took on the challenge. Immediately after the surgery, Dr. Mann held my hand as he told, I can't look at Brenna at this part, as he told me and my daughter Brenna that Brian may not survive the week, and if he did, he wouldn't live long and most definitely would never eat again. He warned us that Brian would be in the hospital at least 10 days, but it could be months. 6 days later, Brian was discharged. And by fall, he was eating and back to work again. In August of 2016, just 2 months ago, Brian flew with my brother Greg for an immunotherapy consult at Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Once there, he suffered an inoperable rupture of the bowel. The doctors told Greg that Brian might not survive, and if he did, he would probably end up in hospice in Baltimore, too weak for the flight home. After a few days, I flew out to Baltimore to relieve Greg and see Brian through whatever was to come next. After a few more days of intense treatment and slight improvement, the medical team decided that getting Brian home was their top priority and approved him for flight. I spent the day before departure in Brian's room on the phone and meeting with medical people to strategize on how to get Brian through the cross-country flight. A nurse practitioner came in to instruct me on giving morphine and told me, don't worry about overdosing him, just keep him comfortable. And if he dies on the plane, she said, stay calm. I know, you don't know whether to With that, and with people in and out all day, Brian barely stirred. He slept through the whole thing. Before leaving Baltimore, I called and warned Bernie and Carrie, who would be staying with Brian, that he was in pretty bad shape. I said if he makes it home, he'll probably crawl into bed and stay there. It was a long and gut-wrenching journey, but Brian made it to SeaTac. Vicki picked us up at the airport with blankets and pillows in the back seat and a beer in the front seat for me, and drove Brian home. The next morning, I heard Brian's bath run. I was in the kitchen when he came downstairs freshly bathed. He plopped himself on the couch, turned on the TV, and asked for some Gatorade. And I looked at Bernie. I said, I swear I wasn't exaggerating. That was so Brian, to defy the expected and follow his own agenda. He was fierce, sometimes even prickly, but I still adored him. I felt that he was a part of my family, a part of me and Rick and our kids, Eric and Brenna. Starting in 1985, he spent every single Christmas with us, except that one year he just had to go to Italy, for which I forgave him. When Eric was 3 and I was in the hospital having Brenna, Brian changed Eric's very last stinky diaper, sorry Brian, for which he never forgave me. That was our relationship, one of banter and camaraderie, framed by Brian's lines in the sand. His childhood nickname was Brian the Lion, and I think you can understand why. And since this is not a eulogy, I won't expand on that. Brian wouldn't approve. I'll just leave you to do the math. Thank you so much. And now, my sister Liz has something to say.